All right, so we're going through the 1800s now. We've been going through British history and we've been looking at classism and racism because we see a link between the two and how classism existed first and then racism was kind of like something that was created, built off the back of classism. And we've been looking, as we do this history, at how did British culture respond to the fact that we are made in God's image. And we've been particularly looking at key functions of being made in God's image, such as having a voice, representing God as an image bearer, the ability to enjoy stuff, and the ability to make assessments and evaluations about stuff. And the Bible tells us that all of humanity is made in God's image with these functions. But we see that we responded a different way to that. And we've seen that in the 1600s and the 1700s. And today, as we look at the 1800s, what we're going to see is that this was a century of justifying white dominance. Okay, of trying to justify why were white people dominant in the world? Why were they dominating black and brown people? So let's just kick off at the beginning of the century. You got a scientist called Edward King who said that the Bible taught different species between creation and the flood. So he's saying that in the Bible, you got the story of creation at the beginning of Genesis, then you got the story of the flood a bit later on. And he was arguing that in the Bible, you see different species here. And he says Adam was the progenitor of the class or species of men endowed with the greatest and most useful abilities. And then he says, whilst Cain had debased his descent from Adam, marrying an inferior caste or species of mankind. So those of you who know the book of Genesis, you know this is nonsense. But this just shows you that back then in the 1800s, someone could say, I'm a scientist. I see this in the Bible. There's an inferior species. Cain married that inferior species, which obviously would have then brought about an inferior group of people. Whereas you've got another species of people from Adam, which have the greatest, most useful abilities. This is what we call eisegesis, right? Where we read into the Bible meanings that we want to find there, as opposed to exegesis, where we take out of the Bible what it says there. Okay, the same year, you get a French doctor, Dr. Jean-Joseph Virey, and he split mankind into beautiful whites and ugly browns or blacks, quote unquote. And here he was influenced by Miners. You might remember from before, we saw this German guy, Miners, who was talking about the skin tone of Europeans. So what we see here is how ideas are making their way across Europe and they are influencing other people. 1807. You get the abolition of the British slave trade. So, you know, that this is what we get taught about in school in Black History Month. You know, we often ignore all the other stuff that went on before it. This year, the slave trade officially, the British slave trade is stopped. But think about it. For 250 years, Britain had traded 3 million people into slavery. Now, you can look up that figure on the National Archives website to see that. And it also show you how many people actually died. So although Britain had traded 3 million people, I think it was 3.1 million on the National Archives, only, I think, 2.6 million or 2.7 million made it across the Middle Passage alive. Okay, that's an awful lot of people who died on the way. Okay. Now, what's weird, though, is that at this time, even though the slave trade's been abolished, in the colonies, slavery was still legal. And even in Britain, it was unclear whether slavery was legal or not. So on the British ports like Liverpool and Bristol, you had slaves being bought and sold. So Britain said, we've now officially ended the slave trade, but you could turn up at Liverpool docks and you could buy a slave if you wanted to, right? Now, there were people at this time in Britain living as slaves in British cities. So someone might get bought at the docks at Bristol, and then they would live as a slave in Britain. What also happened was that the British were bringing slaves from Africa to Jamaica to produce sugar, because on the colonies it was legal. They needed people to help them produce the sugar. So there was still slavery going on. And the other thing that happened was that slave owners, when they would come back to Britain, they would bring their slaves with them. Okay. So when we say in 1807 slavery ended, it's not really the full picture. Okay. But something good that happened, though, is that the following year, 1808, all the way up to 1867, you had the West African Squadron from the Royal Navy. And this was part of the Navy that was set up. It was quite a small force, but they were set up as a squadron to patrol the seas to make sure people weren't slave trading. And if they were, they would then stop them, and they would take the slaves and they would bring them to, like there was a settlement in, the name's escaping me now. You can read about this in David Alashoga's book. But basically what was going on here was that people were using their power to serve and protect. So it's encouraging to see this bit of the story where the authorities were actually saying, we're going to serve and protect now. Okay. Same year that started, 1808, you had a physician in Manchester called Thomas Gerald, and he said red could be the colour of Adam and Eve, as it was an in-between colour. And that might remind you of the exegesis we saw of Genesis 1 before, and the possibility that Adam may have had red skin, or skin, the kind of colour of the soil. Okay. 1810. This is absolutely heartbreaking story of Sarchie Bartman, or Sarah Bartman. She's sometimes known as the Hottentot Venus. And she was a slave from South Africa who was brought to London. It was already bad enough. I think it was either her husband or her fiance had been killed. And then she was brought to London and she was displayed practically naked in a cage, where people viewed her and touched her. Okay, and basically, I don't want to go into more of the story. It's an absolutely horrible story. It's heartbreaking. But what you see happen now is human zoos. And they were called exhibitions, but they were basically human zoos. And they continued throughout the century. They even went into the 1900s, and they were particularly seen in London and Paris. And what we see here is that one of the functions of being made in the image of God is the ability to enjoy stuff. And you see this being twisted here. You see a form of enjoyment, like being twisted. In other words, the whole thing of going to exhibitions as a form of enjoyment, being twisted in a way that doesn't serve and protect. And that also promotes a wrong assessment of image bearers and dehumanizes everyone in the process. So this woman wasn't seen as a representative of the image of God. And it's just horrible and twisted, and a lot of dehumanization going on here. Around the same time, you still had monogenesis around. Okay, you had one like Dr. James Cowles Pritchard in 1813 who said, on the whole, it appears that we may with a high degree of probability draw the inference that all the different races into which the human species is divided originated from one family. Okay, so here is a guy saying all of humanity, all these different races that we see, it's highly probable they came from one family. Now, what's interesting is that this is what a lot of scientists would say today. Okay, but back then there were lots of people saying other things. So it's good that this guy was using his voice. Now, Carlyle, in his book, Natives, he acknowledges that these monogenesists were guided by Christian ideas about the brotherhood of man and that all humanity descended from Adam and thus were branches of the same family. So that is positive, that there were people who are having a biblical assessment and using their voice to share this with others. But around the same time, you got Madame de Stael. You might well have heard of her. And her book on Germany got published in London. And it was so big, it got sold out in 3 days, right? And it brought German ideas of race to London and subsequently onto America. And it meant that this idea of outward beauty, as idealized by ancient Greeks, was seen as a sign of inner value. Okay, so this was not a helpful assessment, but this has now spread from Germany to London and then on to America. What this shows us here is the power of voice. Sharing a view about something can be incredibly powerful of how it influences people. 3 years later, John Bird Sumner, who was later he ended up being the Bishop of Canterbury. In 1816, he argued that polygenesis had the problem. If you remember, polygenesis was the idea that you'd had these different groups of humans who had come about from different pairings all over the place, like as if there's an Adam and Eve over here and another Adam and Eve over here and another Adam and Eve over here. And people were saying, oh, there must have been a white Adam and Eve, and there must have been a black Adam and Eve and a yellow Adam and Eve, and so on. So he pointed out that they had the problem that if features and complexion have never deviated from the mold in which they were first cast 6,000 years ago, then the huge number of differences between people in his day would mean there were many more than 4 races. And for example, all the different tribes in southern Africa would have to be considered a different creation. So what he's doing here is using his assessment and he's using his voice to demonstrate the absurdity of race. And I hope we can all get this today. If you start saying there must be different human races, there must be different species of humans because this guy over here, his nose looks flatter than this guy, and this guy over here, his skin tone is a different tone to this guy. Well, if you're going to start doing that, eventually you're going to have hundreds of races that you've created, because you're going to have some guys that you say, this guy, his forehead is shaped this way, and this other guy, his forehead shaped another way. And then you're going to start talking about different colored eyes, and you're going to talk about different textures of hair and different colors of hair, and then different ways that people's ears are. And if you knew about it, then you might even look at earwax and see the differences of earwax. Just like some of you know this already. You know that in general, well, basically, Europeans and Africans have the same type of earwax, but it's a different type of earwax to Asians. So imagine if people back in the day, instead of measuring skulls and all that nonsense, instead they said, let's look at earwax and the types of earwax. And then they would have concluded, okay, so actually Africans and Europeans are one race over here and Asians are another race. So this guy here really pointed out how ludicrous this whole thing would be. So bit later in 1829, you got a Welsh reverend called Thomas Price. He also argues against polygenesis. And he basically argues, I won't read out the whole quote for time's sake, you can read it later, but at the end of that quote there in the handout, it says, "For in this truth of our common descent from Adam is involved the whole doctrine of the fall and redemption of man." So what he's saying is, he's saying, look, I should have paraphrased the first bit. He's saying you can't compromise the truth of, but sorry, let me rephrase it. If you say that we didn't all descend from Adam, then in the Bible, you can't say we've all fallen. You can't say we all have indwelling sin. You can't say we're all born sinners. And you also can't say we can all be redeemed through Jesus Christ. Okay? You can't do that. It's Romans 5. So here's someone making a theological assessment, right? They're saying, hang on a minute, the Bible teaches us we all sinned through Adam. We can all be saved through Jesus Christ. So if we're not all descended from Adam, that doesn't actually work. So a theological assessment, and then using his voice to tell other people and say, oi, this polygenesis, man, is rubbish. Now let's talk about female abolitionists. So around this time, you've got a lot of female abolitionists in Britain, right? And because of the way the culture was, they had limits on how active and how vocal they could be. But I want to read out a quote from David Alashoga here. He says, "But the humanitarian nature of the abolitionist crusade, with its emphasis on mercy, compassion, and the preservation of the family, was deemed fittingly feminine." So what he's saying there is people are like, this abolitionist thing, you know, it is fittingly feminine for women to be involved in that. Okay. And so this created space, socially acceptable space for female abolitionists to do their thing. And look what they did. They're amazing, right? Female abolitionists, this is still part of the quote, they formed their own organizations and committees. Now, if you're thinking back to our categories of being made in the image of God, this is talking about relationship. The female abolitionists were like, let's form relationships. Let's make relationships with other people. We will form organizations and we will form committees. I'll read the rest of the quote. "They held abolitionist events, wrote pamphlets, tracts and poems, gathered signatures for the petitions." Now, all those things there to do with voice, aren't they? Like this writing stuff and getting people to write stuff, to sign their name, image bearers using their voice to counter all of this nonsense that's been going on. Carry on the quote. "And raised campaign money. At certain times and in certain places, they were the engine room of the movement." So here we look at our category of being made in the image of God as of having power. So these female abolitionists, they were described as the engine room of the abolitionist movement. They are bringing their power. Carry on the quote. "Traditionally confined to the domestic sphere, women brought anti-slavery politics into the home via the sugar boycott." I love that. So you got to bear in mind that Britain was still buying sugar and buying cotton, two things that came from slavery. Britain was addicted to these things. And so on the one hand, you got the powers that be saying women, they should know their place. They should just be in the home. These female abolitionists are like, okay, so we're just in the home, right? We control the kitchen. All right, we're boycotting sugar. I love the way they did that. And then carry on the quote. "The abolitionist movement, especially in its campaigns of the 1820s and 1830s, could not possibly have achieved what it did without their involvement." So I just love that. I just think that is beautiful. Okay, now around the same time, you've got nonconformist missionaries going off to the West Indies, right? And they are teaching the Bible and literacy to slaves because it's still legal in the colonies. Now, slave owners try to stop this from happening. So slave owners use their voice. Slave owners are trying to stop slaves from hearing the voice of God. They are trying to stop slaves from making assessments based on the word of God. The slave owners are trying to use their power to stop the slaves from being empowered by God's word. But it didn't work because you had these nonconformist missionaries there. And what happened was that slaves became preachers and deacons. So they got power. They got their own power as preachers and deacons. And one of them was a bloke called Sam Sharp. And he basically led a rebellion in Jamaica that later became what's called the Baptist War in 1831. And he got executed. But one of the Baptist missionaries, a bloke called William Knibb, he went back to England. He went to the abolitionist meetings and he told them about what was going on. He told them how bad Jamaican slavery was. So again, here you've got this idea of relationship. An image bearer using this function of being made in God's image to form relationship with people, to turn up at abolitionist meetings and then use their voice to tell people this is the badness that is going on. And when we get all the way through all this history and we come up to the present day, this is part of what I'll be suggesting is what we need to be doing, that we need to be forming relationships and using our existing relationships and using our voice to tackle these problems. Okay, let's switch gears for a second and talk about class. There's a guy called E.P. Thompson who believes that 1832 was when the working class presence was, quote, the most significant factor in British political life and galvanized the previously fractured ruling class. What we see here is that relationships are formed when people feel threatened by the lower classes. So if you remember the Barbados slave code of 1661, they were worried that the white indentured servants and the black slaves were going to form together, rise up and destroy their institution of slavery. And so what they did was they pitted them against one another, got them thinking in terms of black and white instead of thinking we are the lower class people. And it galvanized white people so that in the end, you could have lower class white people thinking, well, I am lower class, but now I'm going to look down on the black person and I'm going to have solidarity with my white masters. And in a similar way, in 1832, what you got going on in British politics is that you've got ruling classes who did not agree with one another and they had disunity. But now they start getting worried about the working classes. And so they start galvanizing together. And this is something that we see going on in history. Okay, following year, 1833. There's been all this campaigning from the abolitionists. And there's fear about further uprisings going on. You might remember in the last century, we saw how you had in Haiti, you had this uprising and the slaves actually won. People in Britain were afraid that was gonna happen here. And so you had what's called the Slavery Abolition Bill. So now at this point in 1833, in Britain anyway, it's not just the slave trade that is scrapped, but it's slavery itself. But the crazy thing is that the 46,000 slave owners got compensated. And some of you paid for this, by the way. I paid for some of this with my taxes. The British government gave 20 million quid to these slave owners, which is the equivalent of 17 billion today. So they basically said, look, you guys can't have your slaves anymore. We know that that's hard for you, so we're going to give you the equivalent of 17 billion quid. Now, the thing is, who paid for this? Well, we paid for it. Taxpayers paid for it. It wasn't until a few years ago that we actually finished paying this. And an idea of how tone deaf someone at the Treasury was, you might remember, they actually announced it one day and they actually said, hey, good news, we've paid off that debt to former slave owners. Of course, it didn't make people happy at all. Suddenly we realized, what, you mean some of our taxes will go into these, it's absolutely ridiculous. What's worse as well, though, is that the slaves, they still had to work for 4 more years during what people called an apprenticeship, when they would be made ready for freedom. There was an idea called gradualism, which was you can't free the slaves straight away. It'd be too much of a shock for them. You got to do it gradually. So they made these guys carry on working for another 4 years. The other thing is these guys had to pay rent. So like the huts they're living in by the plantations, they now had to pay rent for those things. So you ended up with people being in so much debt that they were just in poverty the rest of their lives. At the same time, we also got to remember that slavery still existed in America, and Britain was trading with America because we were buying cotton from America. So it's still not all good yet. We haven't really properly disentangled ourselves from slavery yet. But this decade, the 30s, is what's called the antebellum period. In America, this is the period before they have their civil war with the North and the South fighting one another over slavery. And you get these African-American abolitionists who tour Britain giving these accounts of their slavery. And people would comment on how eloquent they were because they spoke in a way that showed how intelligent they were. This is an example of an image bearer using their voice, using their assessment, and using their representation to show that they are someone made in the image of God. 1834, you get the Poor Law Amendment Act, and this is where we move from a parish system to a national network of workhouses and harsh conditions intended to be unappealing. So this is that concept, and you still see it today with this whole mindset of we don't want to make stuff too nice for the poor people, because if they do, they will just be lazy. Okay, this is the mindset. And as you know, Charles Dickens really criticized this system. So here is an example of power in Britain serving and protecting people, but doing it in a harsh way. And we'll come on to Dickens a bit later and see how racist he was at the same time as fighting for injustice. 1837, there's a group called the Aborigines Protection Society, founded by Thomas Hodgkin, who was a Quaker doctor. Okay, so this would be someone who their ethics are governed by the Bible. And this group had a motto, which was in Latin, ab uno sanguini, which means from one blood. It's basically saying that all of humanity comes from one blood, and probably quoting Acts chapter 17, where it says, from one man, God made all the nations. Well, in the King James version, it says from one blood. Unfortunately, it's really unlikely that in the original Greek, it said from one blood. But anyway, back then, that's what people would say. They would say from one blood. Now, the Aborigines Protection Society acknowledged the desolation and utter ruin, that's what they called it, that the empire had caused to native groups, and called for reformation of colonization. So the British Empire had been going for a while, right? But it's at this period where the British Empire has turned to the Pacific, and a bit later turns to Africa, as we'll see. And what you see here is that there were voices back then who were speaking up for justice, who were using their assessment and standing against the tide and saying this colonization is wrong. And they were wanting to see the government change stuff so that they were actually serving and protecting instead of harming people. And why is that significant? It's significant because you'll find historians today, say is it Neil Ferguson, who will talk about the good of the empire and how the empire did good things. And when you try talking to people about the bad things within the empire, people often say, oh, but don't forget all the good things we did as well. And I think it's worth pointing out, or sometimes people will say, well, they were men of their times. I think it's worth pointing out that there were people back then who were saying, hey, this is wrong. What's going on right now is not right. Okay, a couple of years later, 1839, you've got a Scotsman who moves to the USA called Alexander Kinman, and he gave some lectures on the natural history of man. And he basically said that the whole human family is actually sprung from a single pair, but that this single pair possess within them the innate tendency to give rise in the progress of generations to several distinct origins of races. You would have thought this is just pretty obvious at what everyone thought, right? But because of, like we saw in the previous century, this centering of whiteness, people really struggle with this. But what Alexander is saying is that, look, Adam and Eve, genetically within them, had everything they needed so that over the years, all their different descendants, some would be black, some would be white, some would look this way, some would look that way. And one of the points he was getting at was to stop white monogenists seeing themselves as the type or the pattern card after which all other races were to be formed. So you might think, well, surely the monogenists are the good guys, right? Surely they're the guys who say the Bible says we all come from Adam. The problem is that a lot of monogenists were saying, well, everyone came from Adam, but they didn't want to say Adam was black. It was too difficult for them. They wanted to say Adam was white, and they wanted to see themselves as the pattern from which everyone else came. And so this guy is using his assessment. He's looking at the Bible and he's looking at the world around him and saying, yeah, there are all these different people groups. How do we reconcile that with the Bible? Well, they still must have came from Adam and Eve. And then he's using his voice to explain it to people, to try and stop ethnocentrism, to try and stop people centering stuff on whiteness. Okay, this is back in 1839. So just, if any of you are like, you hear people who are saying stuff like, oh, all this modern talk about dealing with whiteness and everything, it's just all this modern progressive liberalism. It's like, you can show them this here, 1839. This was a concern of some people back in 1839, that people were seeing white as the type from, or the pattern card from which all other races are formed. And that there were people like Alexander saying that's not right. Okay. Around the same time, you've got white abolitionists who are anti-slavery, but they're not necessarily for equality, right? So you got people who are using their power to serve and protect, but at the same time, they're wanting to rule over other people. They are, with their relationships, they will work with abolitionists, with black abolitionists to try and stop slavery, but they don't view those other people as equal to them. And one of the best examples of this is a guy called John Scoble. So in 1840, Benjamin Hayden is doing a painting of the anti-slavery convention. Now you could just imagine, at the anti-slavery convention, surely everyone there sees black people as equals. Well, the British secretary of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, a guy called John Scoble, when he was asked about the painting, he didn't want to be standing next to a Jamaican abolitionist called Henry Beckford. Okay? He didn't want to be next to this black guy. And David Alashoga describes it this way. He says, Scoble was passionately committed to stand up for black people, but, so it seems, not to stand beside one. So what you got here is, with this thing of being an image bearer and having relationships with people, you got someone who, you see how it's easier to advocate for equality when someone's far away. It's much harder to treat someone as equal when they're right next to you. The white abolitionists also, whilst they didn't like the fact that slave owners would stereotype their black slaves, the white abolitionists also stereotyped black slaves. So they had this stereotype of black people being very meek, being very grateful, and ready for improvement, obviously to be improved by the white people. What this means is that white abolitionists were actually misrepresenting the people that they were actually advocating for. One example of misrepresentation, but this isn't actually from abolitionists, but this was a common misrepresentation that went on, were the minstrels. So, the minstrels were these people who would paint on blackface and they would do music gigs. It started off in America and then it came to England. And in England, you actually had the white lower classes who would dress up as minstrels. And these musicians would portray stereotypes of black people as silly, unintelligent, and sexual. So back to our categories of image bearers, they were, in terms of representation, they didn't represent the people, they didn't represent black people as able to make good assessments. Instead, they represented them as stupid. They were doing a form of enjoyment, which is music. Most people like music. But the weird thing is that whilst this form of enjoyment misrepresented black people, some have said that it did more to make the white working class anti-slavery than any other formal presentations, which is just really interesting. I think we need to critique the whole minstrel thing and at the same time recognize that it was a vehicle that white working classes learned about the plight of African American slaves, which shows us that there's something about the format of enjoyment that helps to carry a message to people. Now, I just used the phrase African American, and obviously African American was not a phrase that was used back then. But the reason why I use it is because I don't really want to use the phrases what people were using back then, such as Negro. But I do want to emphasize where people were coming from Africa, but also coming from America, either because they've been born in America or because they've lived in America for such a long time. And I want to highlight it because of the following example and others like him. There's a bloke called James Pennington, right? He's an African-American Presbyterian minister in 1841. And he argued against the curse of Cain and the curse of Ham theories that were still going on. And he had three arguments. One, they left the posterity of Cain to perish in the flood. So it's like, what you're talking about, curse of Cain, like Cain's descendants died in the flood. Okay, so scratch that one. Number two, he said black people weren't descended from Canaan. Okay, so it's like, scratch that one. All this curse of Cain. Black people don't come from Canaan. Number three, no indication that any curse should go on to Canaan's descendants. Now, people, if you keep repeating a lie long enough, people believe it, right? Everyone kept saying, "Oh, the curse on Ham was for all of Canaan's descendants forever and ever," type thing. And he's saying there's nothing in the text to say that. So check it out. You got an African-American Christian who's making an assessment from the Bible, unlike many other assessments that have been going on for hundreds of years. He's using his voice, one of the many black voices that have spoken on these issues, but he's been ignored by many people. People carried on saying the curse of Ham myth for years. In fact, I have books that still talk about this. And I've had interactions with Christian leaders in this country who still think that black people have a hard time because of the curse of Ham. And so why I'm highlighting this is to say, hey, this is why we need to listen to other voices. And definitely with a lot of the debates in the last year on Black Lives Matter, there's been a tendency, I think, for a lot of white people to not have actually listened to black voices and not actually have read what have African American church leaders said over the last few hundred years about these topics. Because what we actually find is there's been African American church leaders who consulted the text and they said, this is what the Bible says. I've been studying it with relation to what's going on. This is what it says. And if we ignore them and we just go with whoever our favorite YouTuber is, that we saw them do a video the other day and they've persuaded us of their argument, but we've never consulted black voices from this time period, we do ourselves a disservice and we imply implicitly that God never spoke through black people, that God never gave black people the ability to assess God's word and then speak it to others. So it's a very dangerous position to take. All right, so 1842, Charles Dickens, right? He travels to America. He's disturbed by the slavery he sees, but he's also disturbed by the appearance of black people. So he gets Frederick Douglass's book, sends it to a friend, but before he sends it to his friend, he removes the picture of Frederick Douglass from the book. We'll come on to Frederick Douglass and his book a bit later, but he then writes to his friend, says, there was such a hideous and abominable portrait of him in the book that I've torn it out, fearing it might set you by anticipation against the narrative. Okay, so, you know, that's problematic. You can see there that someone could want to fight injustice for one group of people while being prejudiced about another group of people who he even had sympathy for. At the same time, we also got to point out that whilst Dickens wanted social reform in England, P. Keating has pointed out that the working class people in Dickens' books have the two-dimensional qualities of cartoon figures. So, in terms of representation, allies and advocates don't always represent the people that they are supporting well. All right, 1843, you get Josiah Priest, an American ethnologist. Now, he was an anti-abolitionist. Okay, so he's someone who's against the abolitionists. And he argued there was never any Negro blood in the veins of Adam. Quote. Instead, he said that Negro blood had been created in Ham. He said that Ham was, quote, born a Negro with all the physical, moral and constitutional traits which mark and distinguish that race from the other two races, end quote. Okay, the lengths that people were going to and reading into the Bible stuff that's not there, it's crazy. But he still admitted that Adam and Shem's line was reddish, as in reddish colour, which implied that Jesus was of reddish colour too. So he maintained that Jesus, quote, though born of a Jewish copper-coloured woman, was nevertheless a white man. I can't read it out without laughing. So he's admitting, okay, yeah, true say, Jesus's mum, Mary, for sure her skin was darker, but Jesus was a white man. And then he says, bright, fair complexion, yellow or golden colour hair, hazel or blue cast eyes. I mean, this is just ridiculous. This is an American ethnologist, and obviously ideas from America would make their way over to England just like they still do today, which is why I mention it. And he also said that God made Negro blood in Noah's wife's womb when she was pregnant with Ham. Okay, now you might be like, what? Why all of this? Why all this fabrication? Well, it's so that he could argue for monogenesis as well as slavery. Okay, so that's why. So what we see here is that our assessments get clouded by the benefits we want to keep. You know, when your whole economy is driven by slavery, and when you benefit yourself from slavery, the way you assess slavery in the Bible is probably going to be a bit clouded, which again is why we need people from outside our context sometimes speaking into our context. Now, 1844, you get Robert Chambers. I'm sure you've heard of him, a Scottish geologist who wrote Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. This was basically an early form of evolution, like an early theory of evolution. Now, it's significant, but I also want to point out, before anyone came along with these theories of evolution, there were plenty of us saying crazy stuff about black people. Because sometimes people blame Charles Darwin for racism, and they say, oh, if you think about it, he's the father of racism. But we've seen over these sessions, right, that there was plenty of racism going on, plenty of crazy theories about where black people came from, pre-Adamite theory, all that, and this Josiah Priest stuff here. So let's not blame it on Darwin or Chambers, even though we see how Darwin does play a part. I'm really excited to tell you about 1845. 1845, this is when the book comes out, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Now, last time I suggested you read the book from the previous century by Alauda Equiano. And for this one, I really want to suggest, get this book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. You should be able to get it just in the public domain. Won't cost you anything, or get an audio book of it. So this guy, Frederick Douglass, was a slave in America, and he escaped, and then he came to England, and he toured England, amazing people with the way that he spoke, and he was an abolitionist. Now, in his book, you learn a whole bunch of things about image bearers that I just want to point out. In terms of voice, he points out that the slaves would keep quiet about their conditions because of spies and punishment. Because sometimes a spy would be sent to ask the slave, like, oh, do you like it here? And they'd say, no, the master's really cruel to me. And that was actually a plan. It was a spy. And then they would get beaten for it. I think that's significant because even today, I know that some minority culture leaders in church groups feel uncomfortable speaking publicly about their negative experiences because of how it could then affect their position in the organization, their funding, and so on. Let's talk about assessment. Frederick Douglass, in his book, says that he describes how slaves, just like other people, quote, imbibe prejudices quite common to others. And I just want to point that out there, because today there's a lot of people saying, oh, there's a lot of victimhood out there. A lot of these black people talking about justice, they've just got victimhood and everything. And I want to point out, here you've got an African American speaker who is saying that slaves, like other people, imbibe prejudices quite common to others. And this is what I mean about listening to black voices and seeing how people have already done the work and already said, hey, there's ways that we get our assessments wrong as well, just like other people. And it's important we hear these voices and learn from them, and are not so quick to say, oh, I think they've all got victimhood and they all think they're so righteous and all that kind of stuff. Look what he says about it. He says, and they think their own masters are better than the masters of other slaves, when the very reverse is true. They seem to think that the greatness of their masters was transferable to themselves. Now here he's talking about how slaves, when they met up with other slaves, would argue about whose master was the best. Okay, but then he would say, but when they weren't comparing their masters with other slaves' masters, then they would loathe their masters. So he's just talking about human nature there and saying how your assessment can be skewed both by common prejudice and the system of slavery. He's actually showing how the system of slavery skews your assessment. And he's honest about this. Now, something we learn about representation from his book is that slavery negatively affects the masters as well as the slaves. So he had one of his slave masters was initially a really kind woman, and she became cruel through owning slaves. And he said this, he said, the fatal poison of irresponsible power was already in her hands, and soon commenced its infernal work. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. And in the book, he describes this change in this woman from having this irresponsible power. She is dehumanized. She was made in the image of God, but she becomes more and more dehumanized from being a slave owner. So one of the reasons why it's necessarily to fight against slavery, fight against injustice, fight against racism is because it doesn't just dehumanize the victims, it dehumanizes the perpetrators as well. Now, in terms of relationship, what we learn from Douglass as well is that a converted slave master didn't necessarily treat slaves better. So one of Douglass's masters became a Christian, and Douglass hoped that it meant he might get freed, that his master might treat him better, but he didn't. Instead, the guy became more cruel than he had been before once he became a Christian. But Douglass points out that meanwhile, his master was praying in the morning, noon and night. And in the church, he was, quote, an instrument in the hands of the church in converting many souls. So what we see is that there was a type of Christianity that didn't disciple people with how to relate to slaves as Christian brothers, or even fellow image bearers. So again, that's a question for us today in terms of the discipleship we're doing. Are we actually helping people with how they treat people? In terms of power to serve and protect, Douglass in his book points out that the killing of black slaves was not punished. He talks about a girl, she was 15 or 16 years old, a slave girl. She was in her master's room and the baby was there. And the idea was that the master could sleep and the slave girl was there keeping an eye on the baby. Well, the slave girl fell asleep. So the mistress was asleep, the slave girl was asleep. The baby started crying. The slave master woke up, saw the baby crying, realized that the slave girl had fallen asleep, and basically beat her to death. Murdered a teenage girl for falling asleep in the same room that she was in asleep, where her baby was. Well, what happens? It says he writes about it and says it did produce sensation, but not enough to bring the murderess to punishment. There was a warrant issued for her arrest, but it was never served. So here we see a bit of this heritage, don't we, of a crime committed against a black person and justice not being served. And it helps us understand things like the George Floyd thing is not just like a one-off. It's something that a whole people group have experienced for hundreds of years, and they've documented it. And people have said, look, this keeps happening, that when our lives are taken, there isn't justice, or there's a form of justice. There's a shock. Like here he says it did produce sensation. People are like shocked, like that shouldn't have happened. But then the person doesn't actually get arrested and dealt with properly. Okay, 1847, James Pritchard. He's a leading British ethnologist and he was a monogenist. And he said that melanic or black was the complexion generally prevalent amongst humans. And then he said it may be looked upon as the natural and original complexion of the human species. So here's a monogenist who's okay with saying, hey, do you know what? Adam was probably black. A few years later, 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Massive book. Even the Queen read it. And this book, it did perpetuate stereotypes So unhelpful in that sense. But it was also the most successful means of getting people behind the anti-slavery movement. So it's a book, it's a form of enjoyment, and it's one of the chief ways of changing people's assessments and getting people to serve and protect, even though it didn't properly represent people. And that's, I think, something we see consistently. We see white people trying to help and doing stuff, but often not doing it perfectly, often misrepresenting people in the process, which shows that we have to be very careful of the white savior complex and of assuming, white people have got to be very careful of assuming, us white people, we know how to sort out this problem, because the history shows that even when we did good things about this, we did bad things at the same time. Okay, 1853. Scottish Episcopalian monogenist Daniel Wilson, he visits Philadelphia. I think this is 1853, but I can't tell for sure. And he noticed that there was a symbiosis of polygenist science and bigotry. So you notice these two things together. On the one hand, there's this so-called science where people are saying, hey, our science is showing us that there's been all these different Adam and Eve groups around the world with the different races. And at the same time, there's a bigotry going on. There's a link between the two. And he questioned how far the prejudice of caste and the motives of self-interest or political bias leave the American of the United States open to the impartial investigation of this important inquiry. So in other words, what he's saying is, hey, when I see about this science people are saying and the way they talk about black people, it sounds like people are actually motivated by their money. The money they get from slavery, it sounds like they're motivated by that. So again, this shows us that our assessments can be skewed when we have power to lose. And probably not just losing money, but losing power. 1853. And by the way, I just want to say this. So that Daniel Wilson kind of brings up the whole thing for motives. Why are people saying all this crazy stuff? What's their motivation? I think if we think back to the first session where we talked about looking at the history of how people responded to the image of God, we looked at that Bavinck quote about the way that the flesh will lead you. And I think that what we see with slavery and racism is that this is the way of the flesh. It's the way that it's led. And it's not even as if you had to have three people at the top who engineered the whole thing. It's like anyone who's been at the top engineering anything has been being led by the flesh in doing this. So that's not to say there aren't people that deliberately engineered stuff like the 1661 slave code. What I'm saying is the ultimate force behind it is the way of the flesh and is the way of the devil. And I think one of the things that really cemented this for me was when I read Frederick Douglass's book. There were, a lot of you know that I was in an abusive boarding school for 7 years. Probably one of the few schools that in the last 5 years has had 6 of the teachers that were there put in prison. And there's still more, I hope, to go. So it was an abusive place. When I read Frederick Douglass's book, there was so much stuff in it that I saw that they were doing in slavery there to manipulate the slaves and keep them in check that I saw happen in boarding school. There shouldn't be any link at all between British boarding school and American slavery back in the 1800s, but I could see a very clear link. And I was like, what's the common factor? There can't possibly be any common factor other than the devil and the flesh. That he is the guy masterminding this stuff and doing it. And one of the ways it works out is then people wanting to keep their power, people wanting to benefit from the exploitation of other people. Okay, where are we at now? Oh, 1853. So William Brown, he's African American. He writes a play called Clotel. And in this play, he shows how the slavers used a limited canon of the Bible. So the slavers would often say, oh, but look, it says slaves obey your masters, and they would keep quoting bits, all of us would be able to take bits out of context in the Bible, right? To try and, if we wanted to, which we don't, but to try and argue for slavery. And William Brown, in his play, he then has Uncle Simon, who's a black preacher in the play, says, there's more in the Bible than that. And I just love that line. I love that line so much because I've interacted with British church leaders in the last year who have tried to argue that slavery actually is okay, and that what it says in the Bible actually means that there could be a case for slavery, and as in transatlantic slavery. And now I just say to them, when they try and quote little bits of the Bible out of context, I just say, there's more in the Bible than that, And what's fascinating to me is that the slaves themselves, they knew this, even though they'd had people tear out bits of the Bible that were anti-slavery, like Exodus, somehow they still learned that actually, no, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the Bible that shows that slavery is wrong. And so another character in this play quotes slave traders in reference to 1 Timothy 1, 9-10, where Paul gives a rebuke to slave traders. And I haven't got it in front of me, but if I remember rightly, he says that they won't inherit the kingdom of heaven. So I like this because here's a play. It's a form of enjoyment. And someone's using this form of enjoyment to have a voice that represents how these people were accurately assessing God's word, whilst the people in power didn't accurately assess God's word. Okay, same year, there's an essay on the inequality of the human races by a French writer and aristocrat, Count Arthur de Gobineau. And his ideas later influenced Nazism. Okay, but don't get too proud because we had a British guy who really influenced Hitler later as well. Okay, so don't be like thinking, oh, the French or, this is just a European thing. And in it, he outlined a 3-race hierarchy. And he said, so this is like 3 races as opposed to 4 or any of the other systems people came up with. And he said the Negroid variety is the lowest and stands at the foot of the ladder. His intellect will always move within a very narrow circle. And then he says stuff about the yellow man has little physical energy. He tends to mediocrity in everything. And then he says, we come now to the white peoples. These are gifted with reflective energy, or rather an energetic intelligence. And then he says, if the 3 great types had remained strictly separate, the supremacy would no doubt have always been in the hands of the finest of the white races, and the yellow and black varieties would have crawled forever at the feet of the lowest of whites. So here's the idea of we got to keep these races separate. If the white race had been kept totally separate, it would end up being clearly way above all the other ones. Okay, 1850s, Douglass. So Frederick Douglass, he now says Britain isn't as welcoming as it was in the 40s. This is Britain where the slave trade had been abolished earlier and where slavery had been abolished. But now he says there was less anti-slavery and more racism, which he said was American prejudice coming into the country. And in 1859 and 1860, he said that pro-slavery ministers and minstrels were influencing this. So the idea that there were Christian leaders in America who were saying stuff that was influencing the UK and making the UK more racist. And I think I can personally say that I have seen that in the last year. I have seen some American preachers say stuff that has fueled racism in the UK amongst Christians. So when I read this and saw that this was happening in the 1850s, I was very interested. Let's have an example of some of this stuff that was coming up in the 50s. In 1858 in America, you had the mudsill theory of James Hammond. This is where he said, and this is again where we see class and race intertwined in people's thinking. He said, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. That is, a class requiring but a low order of intellect and but little skill. Okay, now this class, he calls it the mudsill of society. And then he says, fortunately for the South, this is in America, the South. He says, fortunately for the South, she found a race adapted to that purpose to her hand, a race inferior to her own, but eminently qualified in temper, in vigor, in docility, in capacity to stand the climate, blah, blah, blah. So what he's saying here is he's saying, look, you need a lower class that does the hard work. And for the South, we found that class, and it's actually a race. It's actually the African people, and we call them slaves. Now, around this time, you had Christians who saw slavery as God's providence. They saw it as God's plan and God blessing Southern Americans, as in not South Americans, but Southern Americans, blessing them with this class or this race. Okay, so here it's like race basically means class. Now Hammond, he complained about the northern states in America, and he basically said, look, our slaves are black, of another and inferior race. And then he says, yours, which is the northern manual labourers, I've skipped a bit here, if you go to the end of the quote, yours, northern manual labourers, are white, of your own race. You are brothers of one blood. They are your equals in natural endowment of intellect, and they feel galled by their degradation. So what he's saying here is he's saying, look, we, for our slaves, we've taken black people, but you've taken white people as your slaves. In other words, your lower class workers in the north, they're basically like slaves, but they're from the same race as you. That isn't right. So what he's doing here is he's pitting white against black, okay, in an attempt to keep slavery, just like the 1661 slave code. Okay. Notice as well, he says earlier in that, he says they are elevated from the condition in which God first created them by being made our slaves. So that the rhetoric was, we're helping these slaves. God's made them very low. But by making them our slaves, we are bringing them up. It's a crazy assessment. Hammond also attacked British abolitionists, and he said this. He said he's seen clergymen lay aside their Bibles and females unsex themselves to carry on this horrid warfare against slaveholders. So he's saying that abolition goes against the Bible, that these clergymen they're leaving the scriptures, and that the women are not acting like women. They're not acting in a feminine way. And it's just fascinating again, seeing the links with today, where if a Christian leader starts saying, the Bible says that we should care about any injustice committed against black people, some people start saying, oh, you're leaving the Bible now, you're forgetting the gospel, you're becoming a Marxist. And at the same time, it seems to go hand in hand with this whole thing about, oh, I miss the days when men were men, when men were always doing barbecues and hunting and drinking beer and shooting rifles. But now these men, they're so effeminated, they drink lattes. And it's just bizarre. People say, oh, these social justice warriors in their skinny jeans and their lattes, and me, I don't drink lattes and I don't wear skinny jeans, but it's just ridiculous some of the things people are saying now to try and discount the voice of anyone who says, hey, the Bible says we should care about justice. The thing is, though, this racist, this what we could call a new type of racism that was coming into Britain, it wasn't just coming from America. It was also coming from the West Indies, right? So these plantations in the West Indies, they're not doing so well now because slavery isn't allowed anymore, okay? Now, what happens if you want to talk about victim mentality, the planters, and remember the planters were the people with the money, not actually the people planting the crops. The planters, now that they weren't doing so well, they blame the slaves. And they were saying, look, without slavery, these former slaves, they're just naturally lazy. You know, we can't get them to work hard enough now that we don't have slavery in place. And what they said was they said Africans were not fully man. And it was wrong that the abolitionists had spread this message that the Africans were fully man. And people would refer to Edward Long. Remember the guy with the horrible orangutan quote in the previous century? They would refer to his earlier writings in the late 18th and early 19th century. And from the 1814 onwards, this was the message that the planters kept presenting. And at the same time, they were saying, we've been hard done by, us poor planters. Now that slavery's over, it's really tough for us. That's what they were saying. And Carlyle says, ironically, in the years following the abolition of slavery, ideas like Mr. Long's, ideas that some groups of people, particularly black people, were not really human, started to hold sway. These ideas were generally promoted by the Polygenesis, who believed in several separate origins for the different races of men. And I think it's quite clear that the assessment of these planters was motivated by greed. So even though slavery's been scrapped, there's a new type of racism coming out. There's almost like a sort of backlash against slavery being ended. And in 1849, you've got people like Thomas Carlyle, who was a British historian back then. He said that the plight of poor white people, especially the Irish, was more important and no less worse than black people's. And he also downplayed the horrors of slavery. So again, here's someone using their assessment and their voice to pit white suffering against black suffering. And we still see people try and do this today, you know, say, oh, well, what about the white working class? And we will later in the future come on to when that, you know, the term white working class, when it started being a thing and started being used. But the point here is that obviously they should deal with how poor white people and the Irish people were treated. But the English hated the Irish, and the way they treated the Irish was terrible. What they should do is deal with those issues and deal with how they treated black people. But instead it gets used as an excuse to just say, oh no, we really need to focus on the white people. You know, it's much worse for them than the black people. Okay, 1855. Here's an American quote here, and I don't want to get in it too much because it's America, but I just want to point out that here they mention, this is Nott and Gliddon, and here they mention, if you look at the end of this quote, in the book of Acts, they say that the only text in the New Testament which refers directly to the unity of races is that in Acts, God hath made of one blood all nations of men. And then they say, if you scroll down to the end of the quote, he knew nothing, this is talking about Luke, he knew nothing of the existence of races or nations beyond the circumference of the Roman Empire. So there they're trying to say, look, it might say that everyone came from one man, but Luke didn't really know much, you know, so they're trying to explain that away. But as we know, you don't have to go to Acts, you just go to Genesis chapter 1 and you see that we all came from Adam, you know, or you can go to Romans 5, like you're not dependent on Acts. Now, Frederick Douglass criticized this, And he said the credit of the Bible was at stake. And he said the same about people arguing for slavery. He's saying, the credit of the Bible is at stake. Okay, 1856. This is when they discovered Neanderthal remains. Okay, and what's really interesting is the guy who did what's his name, Ernst Haeckel. The guy who gave a name for what they should call the Neanderthal man, he came up with the name Homo stupidus, okay, which obviously means stupid man, okay. And in 1861, a few years later, Thomas Huxley, an English biologist, said that indigenous Australian skulls were wonderfully near the degraded type of the Neanderthal. Now, why is that funny? Well, it's funny because some of you know this. We've now discovered that Neanderthal DNA is closely linked with European DNA. If you're European, you have a DNA link with the Neanderthals, but the Australians don't. The indigenous people of Australia do not. And what do they say about the Neanderthal man now? They were very intelligent. They could sing songs, they could make things and all this stuff. So isn't that interesting that in the early days, they discovered Neanderthal remains and they're like, oh, they must be like the indigenous Australians and very stupid and degraded. And now that they realize us Europeans are linked to Neanderthals, suddenly Neanderthals are highly intelligent beings. Okay, that might have raised all kinds of questions for you about Neanderthals, but we can't go into that now. So sorry about that. Okay, 1856, Edward Lane, a British Orientalist, that's what they were called back then. He said that Adam by creation received a physical nature specifically the same as that of the pre-Adamites. So he's advocating pre-Adamitism, and he's saying that by his fall, he assumed a corrupt moral nature rendered more guilty than that of these latter by his superior knowledge, that he transmitted this physical and moral nature to his sons and daughters, and that these, by their intermarriages with persons of pre-Adamite origin, while they transmitted the same physical and moral nature to their descendants, effected also a union of blood between their own progeny and all the non-Adamites. Okay, well, you might need to read over that whole quote later to fully understand what he's getting at. I just want to say that this assessment he's come up with would have appeared to have the following benefits in his mind. It means he can maintain the biblical narrative of Adam. It also means he can maintain salvation from Jesus's death. It also means he can avoid concluding Adam was black, which is basically what it comes down to, I think, in all these cases. If all these people coming up with these strange things would just say, hey, maybe Adam was black, then we wouldn't have all these mad things people come up with. 1857, George Fitzhugh in America said we had better give up the Negroes than the Bible. And then a few years later became a polygenist. 1859, you had Darwin's Origin of Species, and that meant that polygenesis was not seen as crucial anymore. People didn't need to argue for polygenesis anymore because Darwin had come up with a system that people could say, oh, well, we'll go with this one instead. Darwin, what he gave people kind of gave an explanation for the chain of being. If you remember when we looked at philosophical precursors to racism and classism, you had this chain of being and Darwin basically gave people a framework, understanding for seeing how that could happen to humanity with white people at the top. So you didn't have to have a white Adam anymore. You could have a black Adam, and the idea that over time he's progressed and evolved to a white person. Okay. Then 1860, Samuel Cartwright of New Orleans, he basically argued that in Genesis 1:24, he basically said there's two races. There's one called living creatures because of the Hebrew word nephesh. So he's saying you've got like Adam and Eve being created, but then you've got the nephesh being created. So he argued two races from that. Absolute nonsense. The same year you had Charles Kingsley. Sorry if I'm going to ruin the water babies for you. I really liked this book when I was a kid. But he said this: I am haunted by the human chimpanzees I saw in Ireland. To see white chimpanzees is dreadful. If they were black, one would not feel it so much. Okay, so he saw Irish people when he went to Ireland. And he came back and he called them white chimpanzees. He racialized them. And in British periodicals of the 19th century, the Irish were depicted as apes, pigs, snakes, monsters, wild beasts. You know, you can find cartoons, you know, where they're kind of made to look like monkeys. So it's really interesting that this representation thing where they were representing the Irish as non-human. Now, eventually you got to the point where the Irish were considered as white. But for a while, the Irish were not considered as white. Okay. Notice the assessment here as well, that perhaps black non-humans could be tolerated, but the idea of whiteness being associated with non-humans was too much for Kingsley. Okay, 1861, Philip Schaff. Okay, I know at least one of you in this room knows who this guy is. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm gonna ruin it for you now. I bought this book. He wrote a book called Slavery in the Bible, a tract for the times. He wrote it in 1861 in America, and I've really appreciated reading his church history over the years. It's amazing how much church history he collated. And I was like, I'm really looking forward to hearing this brother explain how slavery's wrong. So I paid for this. And I started reading it and I was like, huh? Straight away, he follows the Curse of Ham myth. And he calls Negroes one of the inferior races. And he describes our modern abolitionists of the infidel type who secularize the holy philanthropy of the gospel. In other words, they're like cultural Marxists. They're doing this social justice business. You know, that's basically an early form of that argument. And he says they subordinate the spiritual relations to the temporal. So in other words, they're bothered about slavery, but really it's just about spiritual matters. We should be saving souls. But so he does this, and I was really disappointed when I read this. I was like, what? But at the same time, he explains that slavery in the Bible was humane, and he advocates for the reforming of slavery and for gradualism. So he basically says, look, in the Bible, the way slavery was done in the Old Testament and the way the New Testament talks about it, it's not supposed to be done the way that people in the world do it. And he basically says, what you guys got to do is treat your slaves in a good way, and you've got to get them ready and start reducing slavery so that these guys can be freed eventually. Now, I don't agree with his point, but I just use him as an example of someone who a lot of us would have benefited from. But notice how his assessment, when he starts with the Curse of Ham at the beginning, what if he just listened to the voices of African Americans who'd already talked about this? What if he'd seen they'd already done the work, they'd done the exegesis to say, hey, that doesn't work on 3 levels. There's 3 reasons why that doesn't work. What if he'd listened to them instead of doing his theologizing on his own? Instead of doing what, he's a white European living in America. Instead of doing white theologizing in a white context, what if he'd got some help? Okay, after this, you got the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. People some people in England supported the North and some supported the South. And what I find interesting is that, so some of the people who supported the South were people who wanted to benefit from the cotton trade, okay? But some of the people who had the most to lose financially, they still supported the North. They wanted to see slavery ended because they thought anti-slavery was a British value. And they saw plantation owners like the British aristocrats. So again, this link between class and race. Rochdale was the most anti-slavery town. And the mill there, they ran out of cotton. It was a terrible time for people in England right now, especially for like mill workers, like a terrible time with the economy because of the American Civil War. But the owner of this mill, John Bright, who was a friend of Frederick Douglass, he still paid his workers 2/3 of their wages. And he wrote letters about slavery to Abraham Lincoln's inner circle. I really like that story. He's doing his own little furlough scheme out of his own pocket. And so here you got the relationship aspect of image bearers having class solidarity. British people saying, hey, because we don't like the aristocracy, we are going to be anti-slave in America. And you're seeing serving and protecting going on. Whether it's white people or black people or both who are in need, it's like, well, let's help. And I think that's wonderful. An example of either regenerated hearts or an example of God's common grace impacting people in a way that's contrary to the flesh. Okay, I want to see how we can quickly rush. We're not going to get through all this stuff here. So let me just think, what can we skip out? Because you can read some of this. You got a guy called John Colenso, an English Anglican bishop of Natal, working with Zulu people. He had a problem because he was like, I'm looking at the Bible and he's thinking, I don't think there's enough time looking at the Bible to see how all these different people groups could have formed from the time of the flood to now. Okay, so this was one of the things people were wrestling with. A lot of people back then are saying the world has existed for 6,000 years. You can look up the history of that, or how the 6,000 year figure came up. And so people were saying, if the flood wasn't as far as 6,000 years ago, how did we end up with all these different people groups from Noah's family? Surely it would take a bit longer. So this was one of the genuine questions that people had, that they were wrestling with. And so you can read about what John Colenso thought about that. 1863, you had Dr. Hunt from the London Anthropological Society, who said that Africans were a different species to Europeans. They were closer to apes, and that their intelligence slowed after childhood. And then he says that in the West Indies, when he says, quote, all the Negroes in places of trust which require intelligence have European features. Civilized blacks are not pure Negroes, but in nearly every case, they have European blood in their veins. This is an anthropologist saying this. Now, what's interesting is, around the same time, you got someone called Sarah Forbes Benita. She's a slave girl who ends up becoming the Queen's goddaughter. You've got to read her story if you don't know it. And what's interesting is that she was described by Captain Forbes as a perfect genius, speaks English well and has a great talent for music. She is far in advance of any white child of her age in aptness of learning and strength of mind. Okay. What Captain Forbes thought was, he thought, look, she's way ahead of the white kids her own age. And he was thinking that as she gets older, she will be able to demonstrate to people that it's not true that black people slow down intellectually as they get older. Because as she gets older, people will see she's still smart, and that will help counter that myth. Read more about her later. It's a very interesting story. So more stuff we're going to skip over. 1864, Reverend Dingle at the Anthropological Society of London, he said that polygenesis had been used to justify the most outrageous oppression and to palliate the most disgusting cruelty to indigenous people. So that just shows how big ideas are. And if we get our ideas wrong, our understanding of stuff from the Bible wrong, can lead to massive implications. Okay. Going to skip out some more stuff. 1864, I have to tell you this. Bethnal Green. There was an article in a popular magazine. The article was called The Bethnal Green Poor. It was talking about white people, working class people, and it described them as a caste apart, a race of whom we know nothing, whose lives are of different complexion from ours, persons with whom we have no point of contact. The white lower classes here are being racialized. They are being talked about like they are a different race, just like Irish people were, just like black people were. 1865, you get Morant Bay. We haven't got time to look at Morant Bay now, but please read what's in the handout there. And notice that, just read it and look at it yourself. There's a lot of stuff to think about with regards to what happened at Morant Bay in Jamaica. Okay. Boy, what do we miss out here? What do we keep? Okay, 1865. Thomas Henry Huxley, aka Darwin's Bulldog. What a great nickname. He was an English botanist. He wrote an essay on the emancipation of black slaves, which he thought was morally right, but thought equal rights was an illogical delusion. So again, it's an example of some people would look down on slavery, but would also look down on black people. They did not want equality. Okay, I'm going to skip out any stuff that any American clergyman said, just because it's in America. 1867, George Harris brings up 1 Corinthians 15:22. And he says, "For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive." Okay, what does he say about this verse? He says this verse does not necessitate all people being descended from Adam. He could still be their representative head. So I don't know how he thinks that verse would mean that not everyone has to be descended from, but somehow he's saying that Adam could be the representative head, even if these people hadn't actually descended from him. Okay, 1867, same year, you get the Reform Bill, which meant that not all urban working class men could vote, but some could vote now. Okay, and Walter Bagehot, or Badgerhot, however you say his name, who was the founder of The Economist, which you've probably heard of, he said this. He said he wasn't happy with the Reform Bill, and he said, if men differ in anything, they differ in the fineness and the delicacy of their moral intuitions, however we may suppose those feelings to have been acquired. We need not go as far as savages to learn that lesson. We need only talk to the English poor or to our own servants, and we shall be taught it very completely. The lower classes in civilized countries, like all classes in uncivilized countries, are clearly wanting in the nicer part of those feelings, which, taken together, we call the sense of morality. So what he's doing, you might need to read through that again a couple of times to fully get what he's saying, but he's equating the English poor with every class of the savage races. So he's saying there's these races out there who are the savages, and they don't have good morals. They can't think morally. And it doesn't matter what class they are, they've all got bad morals. But if you come over to the white race, people higher up have good morals, but the lower classes have bad morals, just like any classes of the savage races. So again, we're seeing race and class be linked together and saying that lower class people and people of different races have an impaired assessment of morality. Okay. 1869, there's a new Australian law that meant that half or quarter or other percentage caste children could be removed from parents. Okay, that's, if you're British, that's part of our history right there with the British Empire, that we actually said that people could be removed from their parents if they had some supposed amount of blood from an indigenous race. Okay, 1871, let's go back to Darwin. In The Descent of Man, he gave the idea that all the races shared a common origin because they had so many similarities. Now, he was also anti-slavery, but he believed in an evolutionary hierarchy, and he thought that the, quote, children of savages were more likely to pout when they're sulking due to their proximity to the primordial condition. Okay, ridiculous. We know that all children pout, but that's what he said. 1874, there's a tract in England. We don't know who wrote it. It was called Clearer Light. And it said that the mark of Cain changed Cain's hair and skin, and he became the father of black people. Okay, now we know, because we read it earlier, there was an African American years before who said Cain's descendants would have died in the flood. So ridiculous. But again, this is why it's at our peril to not hear the theologizing of different people groups. Okay, 1875. No, that's American. We'll skip that. 1870 to 1900. You got a 30-year period where Africa goes from 10% of it being controlled by Europe to 90% of it being controlled by Europe within 30 years. The massive continent of Africa. Now, because of the idea of social Darwinism, people looked at this and they just said, oh, well, that just shows us that Africans are a weaker race and they should be ruled by a stronger race. They should be ruled by Europeans. And this view got spread through the newspapers and stuff, but it also got spread to the poor people in England, because in 1870 there was children's education was made compulsory. Now, what that meant was that all the lower class white kids in Britain were now sitting in the schoolroom and they were being told, yes, the Africans are an inferior race to us, and that's why we're doing what we're doing in Africa. So again, see the link between class and race being intertwined here. 1879, Martin Delany, an African-American physician and abolitionist. He points out that when Jesus needed to be saved as a baby, he traveled to Egypt, which is in the continent of Africa. He pointed out that Simon of Cyrene was, quote, the African was the first bearer of the cross of Jesus Christ, as yet another evidence of the favor of providence to this race for its mission. So here you've got an African American pointing out Jesus goes to Egypt, the guy who carries the cross for Jesus. So at the beginning of Jesus's life, near the end of his life, Africa helps out. So it's just showing that from the scriptures that Africa is not this subdominant, subdominant is not, I can't think of the word right now, but anyway, he's doing a biblical assessment and using his voice to spread this to others. Okay, 1880, Alexander Winchell. Very interesting theory he comes up with, where he's saying if Christ's atonement was retroactive, in other words, if Jesus' death on the cross paid for all the people who had faith in God before Jesus was born, then he was saying, why couldn't his atonement be a few thousand years earlier, further retroactive? And so in other words, what he's saying is the pre-Adamites, so he's arguing for pre-Adamites, and he's saying the pre-Adamites could be saved by Jesus's atonement being applied retroactively. Very interesting. Again, it's just mad, all the kind of hoops people are trying to jump through to maintain that Adam was white. So you can read the rest of his stuff there. Okay. 1897, African-American Martin Delany is the guy who brings up the fact that the Hebrew word Adam signifies red, dark red. And so he's saying that the original Adam would have been that kind of color. And he's basically saying he'd be the color of North American Indians. So again, that's interesting, similar to what we've looked at as a possibility in the past. Okay, let's finish with Galton, 1883. I said there was a Frenchman who influenced Hitler. Well, so did Galton. This is the English biologist, Francis Galton. He's the guy who came up with the term eugenics, okay? This is where we get eugenics from. And he said that he wanted to better the intelligence and the health of people through controlled breeding. He said that a race could be bettered and evolve at a faster rate if the least intelligent weren't encouraged to have children, whilst the brainiest people were encouraged to have children, and he thought this would give us a utopia. Of course, with Galton, whatever, and with the people who still follow this line of thinking today, it's lower class people that are discouraged to have children, and it's the higher classes that are encouraged to have children. And you hear people today talk about how, oh, these women on benefits need to be sterilized. This comes from Galton right here. But what happened was he set up a lab to measure people's differences, and set up a lab so he could, measure the size of people's skulls, measure the size of their arms and everything. And he was obsessed with measuring stuff to try and work out the differences in people. And his lab was supported by the British Medical Association. And next time we will see how this leads to the Holocaust of 6 million Jews. And we see how a lot of the stuff that then happened later was a consequence of all this nonsense that we've been ploughing through, which is why this stuff is significant if we want to make a break from it. So let me leave you with this question to think about. Where is there white dominance in our organizations and networks? And how is it justified? Because I think that in this century we just looked at, white people were dominating the world and doing it in a bad way, but it was being justified the whole time. Some people were using Bible verses to justify it and doing eisegesis in a way that was socially acceptable. And people would nod their heads and say, yeah. So are there ways that we might still be doing that today? Are there ways that we allow our organizations and our movements to be primarily dominated by white people? Do we have explanations that we use to explain it away, instead of considering that maybe we're doing something wrong. Maybe we're following a trend that we need to change. Okay.
Just on a practical thing, in terms of like when you've got resources, or it's a theologian or a preacher or somebody who's written church history or something, and there's some good stuff there that you want to kind of quote, but you're aware that this person is like, they kept slaves, or they said really horrible things about people, or there was kind of contradiction and stuff. Would you kind of recommend like saying that each time you kind of quote them, or do you know what I mean? Or just avoid, do you know what I mean? Or not quote them in certain contexts, or
That's such a good question, and I've heard different answers from different people on that, and so I feel like I can only give an approach that I'm taking at the moment, but aware other people have different. So for me, if I can find the source somewhere, if I can find the same thing said somewhere else from someone who didn't play a part in people being kidnapped and brutally treated for years, then I will. And if I can't, then I'll use it, but I will try to bring up the fact, or make sure the people I'm using it with have heard me plenty of times in the past bring up the fact this guy was a slave owner. The same way that if so I just thought of a guy now, I won't say his name, but he got outed from ministry as a well-known pastor years ago, and it's like, if I used his name, he's got some great quotes, but it's such a distraction now if I used his name, because people would think of all the controversy and everything. And if anyone had been hurt by his ministry, it would be doubly painful to them. They'd be like, why are you using the name of someone who's caused me so much pain? So I think if I know that there isn't anyone in the circle I'm talking to who doesn't have a problem when we mention this person's name, and I don't even know if I'm making sense right now. Basically, I try and find someone else who said a similar thing, or I use them and I mention the fact that they were a slave owner, unless I've mentioned it again recently and everyone knows, oh yeah, he's that slave owner guy.